see if we can get this working. Good morning. How's everyone feeling? Did you get some sleep last night? I don't think you're going to get any tonight, so. It is an honor to be here with you today. It's true, Data and Society has been doing work on different issues of journalism for quite some time, and my hope today is to provide what will be a provocative talk to inspire you to engage over the next couple of days. I'm going to begin by saying, last week, Facebook and Twitter were accused during a congressional hearing of conservative bias. This should sound kind of familiar to many of you in the room, for you too have been accused for political purposes of being liberal media. This is actually a strategic stunt architected by a set of media manipulators designed purposefully to trigger outrage amongst conservatives in order to pressure news and social media to react. And it works. Over the last 2 years, both social media and news media organizations have desperately tried to prove that they aren't biased. But what's at stake is not whether these organizations are restricting discussions about free market economics or failing to allow conservative perspectives to be heard. What's at stake is how fringe groups can pervert the logics of media to spread conspiratorial and hateful messages under their false flag of conservatism. Accusations of conservative bias are not evaluated through evidence because reality doesn't really matter to those who are trying to spread conspiratorial frames. That's part of what makes the stunt so effective. News organizations and tech companies have no way to prove their innocence. What makes conspiratorial messages work is how they pervert evidence and use evidence to suggest their frames are right. The simplest technique is to conflate correlation and causation. So conspiratorial makers point to the data that suggests that both journalists and Silicon Valley engineers are more likely to vote for candidates from the Democratic Party, or that they have higher levels of education than the average American, or that they're more likely to live in blue states. And as my colleague Francesca Tripodi points out, the accusing tech of conservative bias also leverages and reinforces a strategically placed misunderstanding of how search engines and social media work. She notes, people believe Google is weighing facts instead of rank ordering results that match the entered keywords. The goal is to drive a wedge into the public. And when that is the goal, it's not hard to encourage people to see bias. Contemporary extremism is designed to increase polarization. One tactic is to twist frames. For example, ideological diversity has been deployed to suggest that people who hold conservative viewpoints experience a loss of opportunity similar to those who face systemic racism and sexism. But this isn't about the history of economic inequality in the United States. It's a dog whistle. It's about using nominal conservatism as a cloak to promote toxic masculinity and white supremacy. It's about extremists using conservatives to achieve specific goals. And it's about intentionally twisting historical pressure to diversify newsrooms in Silicon Valley in order to open an Overton window. Fundamentally, it's a technique to grab power by gaslighting the public and making reality seem fuzzy. Now, don't get me wrong. Journalism has historically played a central role in shaping public discourse. Through editorial processes, news organizations have served as gatekeepers and chosen what to amplify. And many critics have challenged the media's power to do so over the years. Now, ideally, a newsroom represents and reflects the norms of society. But that doesn't mean it's always worked perfectly. You know that. Furthermore, this process has gotten a lot more complicated in the last 25 years as new tools of amplification have emerged. And that's a lot of what we're grappling with today. So as we sit here, we're struggling in a moment where both tech companies and news organizations are trying to figure out their role in the distribution and promotion of different kinds of speech. Like universities and think tanks, they are being pushed into a corner that they don't understand. In response, and out of fear of being accused of conservative bias, conference promoters are inviting speakers to the stage to share messages of toxic masculinity and white supremacy under the rubric of hearing both sides. News organizations are profiling extremists as legitimate voices to perform a version of neutrality that is rooted in false equivalency. And social media companies are hesitant to ban people who flagrantly and hatefully violate their terms of service out of fear as being painted as censors. How did we get here? The stark reality is we got played, and we're going to continue to get played until we start actually addressing what's at stake. My goal today is to start that conversation and to start innovating ways in which we can actually approach this challenging issue facing us. In the United States, the First Amendment of the Constitution is sacrosanct. So let's remind ourselves of precisely what is said. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Congress shall make no laws curtailing the freedom of speech. Congress shall pass no laws curbing the freedom of the press. Of course, in the public imaginary at this point, the First Amendment has turned into a colloquial notion that no one, not the news media, not social media, not teachers, not conference organizers, not universities, should engage in any act that in any way limits anyone else's ability to speak. As a result, it's common for someone to accuse someone else for violating the First Amendment, even though that's absurd. No one of us is Congress. This misinterpretation of the First Amendment becomes unoperationalizable pretty fast. A conference like this has only so many speaking slots. Not every voice or every perspective can possibly be represented. The same is true for the front page of a newspaper. Editors must make curatorial decisions. Choosing what to amplify is not the same as curtailing someone's ability to speak. Now, the dot-com bubble, obsessed with e-commerce, sort of obfuscated Silicon Valley's longer-standing obsession with building tools for online community, communication, and information. Commitment to free speech goes a long way back in Silicon Valley. In the 70s and 80s, geeks built Usenet and BBSs to amplify voices amongst each other in order to not rely on a printing press. They problematically imagined themselves as extending the American frontier and not really being new governors. After the bust, social media and search engines took center stage. And now we can now look at an esoteric passage of a 1996 regulation known as the Communications Decency Act as the key to enabling platforms to become platforms without fear of legal prosecution. The stark reality is that no one who was building the blogging software or social media of the early days imagined that they were doing anything other than giving people a new platform to speak. They saw these tools as a gift, designed to allow people to connect in new ways, a natural extension of zines and pirate radio. My peers who were building blogging tools so they could share their perspective on issues of the day sort of struggled with the fact that esteemed journalists kept dismissing them as web diarists. Recognizing a long history of ethnic media challenges to mainstream news media, my peers worked hard to open up the range of possible voices that could be heard. Tools like Slashdot, Global Voices, and Reddit were all originally designed to increase the range of voices that people could hear. Everyone realized that niche communities could propagate online even if they didn't have the kind of scale to have audiences in mainstream media. But over the last 25 years, the tech industry has held steadfast to its commitment of creating new pathways for people who have historically not been able to be a part of the social dialogue. Yet at this moment in time, those who built these tools and imagined letting 1,000 flowers bloom are stepping back really uncertainly and asking a question of what hath we wrought. Like the ACLU and other staunch free speech advocates, we all recognize that we would need to accept a certain amount of ugly speech if we created platforms. But never in any of our wildest imaginations did the creations of major social media realize that this would mean that the amplification of weaponized speech would allow for people to be radicalized through extremism. We didn't realize that these tools could be used to gaslight publics, and no one was prepared for the degree in which these would become vehicles of cruel harassment. So it's early August of this year, and major technology companies finally had to accept that they needed to ban a well-known conspiracy theorist who was strategically, intentionally, and flagrantly violating their terms of service. Apple, Facebook, Spotify, and YouTube removed numerous podcast and video channels he operated. These sites had previously given him many warnings for violating community standards, but he did not care. What worried the tech companies and what took them so long was that they were worried that blocking him would feed into his agenda. They had watched it happen before. In the summer of 2016, Twitter had finally blocked a different provocateur after he flaunted the violations of the terms of service and engaged a sustained racist harassment campaign. He knew how to turn any effort to call him out for harmful behavior on its head in order to imply that it was actually him who was being oppressed. So when he was finally banned from Twitter, he cried victim, arguing that he was being banned for conservative beliefs. News outlets struggled to respond to his claims, but they gave him tremendous airtime and ink as they processed it through. In the process, they made him famous. During the 2016 RNC convention, he publicly thanked Twitter and those in the media for helping him become a celebrity. Even after losing a book deal, being banned from major platforms, blocked from speaking, being publicly shamed for his own words, this provocateur is still far more powerful in shaping views and radicalizing people than he was before he was banned from Twitter. After the conspiracy theorist was kicked off of major platforms in the thick of August, a frenzy of news stories emerged, reporting on the removal, dissecting the decision, challenging other technology platforms to remove his content, analyzing the responses of tech leaders, and more broadly debating the politics of free speech and the internet. TV newscasters spent hours bringing in experts to analyze the situation. And with each news article, the conspiracy theorist and his channel were named. Not surprisingly, the gush of free advertising benefited the conspiracy theorist. Curious to learn more, thousands of people downloaded his app, found his website, and otherwise sought out his messages to see what he was all about. News outlets have been quick to point to the highlight that the ban cost him tremendous revenue, which is true. That was never his goal. His goal is to produce stunts to motivate people to see the media as a tool of censorship. He wants to cultivate a network of people who will engage in self-investigation. In other words, his goal is to convince people to look and to use you to do so. Media manipulators have developed a strategy with 3 parts that rely on how the current media ecosystem is structured. 1, create spectacle using social media to get news media coverage. 2, frame the spectacle through unique phrases that can drive new audiences and new frames into search engines. 3, become a digital martyr in order to radicalize others. These steps rely on the relationship between social media, news media, and search engines. So let's unpack that and see what that looks like. It's not clear who first asked whether or not the massacre at Sandy Hook was a hoax, but that notion was circulating on talk radio among well-established conspiracy theorists within days of the mass shooting. That conspiracy connected multiple well-trodden frames, most notably the presence of a deep state that wanted to limit access to guns and the idea that the news media was operating on behalf of the Obama administration. As conspiratorial thinkers and other digital actors obsessed over the story, they devised a new term to describe the people who appeared on TV. They called these people crisis actors. This concept is actually linked to an earlier phenomenon that Whitney Phillips had documented called RIP trolling. In various message boards, people lamented what they called grief tourism, referring to the tendency of well-meaning people to post messages on someone's MySpace page, Facebook page after they died, even when they didn't know that person. In response, trolls responded through cruel commentary, sick jokes, and harassment to attack anyone who added to the conversation surrounding someone's death. RIP trolling was a form of harassment, but it was also a way of mocking how social media and news media created spectacle around death. By labeling those who had witnessed terroristic gun violence as crisis actors, conspiracy theorists didn't simply seek to undermine those who were sharing the stories. They wanted to troll the news media. Some had a political agenda, others simply wanted to mock the media for its grief tourism, but collectively they wanted to see doubt in the public about the honesty of the media's reporting. Now, phrases like crisis actors don't spread naturally through word-of-mouth networks, even on social media. To get them in the public lexicon, media manipulators must convince major media amplifiers to work on their behalf. Over the last 6 years, networks of online antagonists have jumped on every mass tragedy in order to manipulate the media and propel this term into the mainstream. They use fake accounts on social media to talk to journalists, to ask them questions, to ask whether or not there's any truth to the idea that there are crisis actors. They deface Wikipedia entries, they try to manipulate trending topics and autocomplete on search. They do everything possible in order to get the frame of crisis actors into the eyes of journalists. Because algorithms aren't their target. Journalists are their target of their digital shenanigans. Now, manipulators are not trying to get journalists to say that the witnesses to gun violence and terrorism are actually crisis actors. To the contrary, the goal is to get the news media to negate the frame and negate the conspirators who are propagating that frame. Now, this might sound counterintuitive, but when news media negates a conspiratorial frame, the people who are most open to conspiracy will want to then self-investigate precisely because they don't trust the news media. As a result, this negation enables a boomerang effect. This is Pizzagate. This is anti-vaxxing. Propelling a term into the public lexicon is only the first step. Don't get me wrong, it's fun to manipulate major newscasters, and there's a lot of celebration that goes on when that happens. But a secondary goal is to get the search term that people have never considered before. Once news media starts negating the concept of a crisis actor, searches escalate. What do they find when they see those searches? In the first few days after Parkland, for example, they found blog posts and online conversations staged to mock news media and gaslight the public. So let me share the first one that came up. It was a video from the aforementioned conspiracy theorists focused on crisis actors, and it opens with, "Are we saying the shooting didn't happen? Are we saying they're all actors and that they're faking that something happened? No, the media is saying that. What we're saying is that school shooting survivor turned activist dad, Hogg's father, is in the FBI, appears to have been coached." This particular video then continued on to imply that Anderson Cooper is a well-known CIA operative and describe how CNN fakes things, all to build the case that David Hogg is fundamentally a Democratic Party operative. Now, viewers might not actually believe everything, but again, that's not the goal. The goal is to initiate them into frames that they've never considered, just because they wanted to find more information on a term that they heard in the news. And that's why they're triggered to search. They're triggered to search in order to actually be introduced to specific frames. Using search to your advantage as a media manipulator, using search as a process is really what Michael Golubetsky calls a data void. When people search for a phrase that does not have a natural, informative results, it's easy for manipulators to control the results. Take, for example, did the Holocaust exist? No one produces content to combat that frame. So when people search for that phrase, what they find is really conspiratorial. Media manipulators design and exploit data voids. They galvanize around phrases, create digital content around that phrase, and then work to push those phrases into the mainstream lexicon by using news media's instinct to cover something new. And when it came to crisis actors, they knew what search results would appear at the top, especially on YouTube. Now, Google and Bing rely really heavily on legitimate news content to cover up data voids during breaking news situations. But YouTube is a disaster. First, there's a lot less content on YouTube, which means the problematic content surfaces to the top much faster. Second, YouTube isn't simply a search engine, it's also a recommendation engine that encourages people to view more videos as they go on a journey. This is great for music discovery, but not so great when manipulators game the recommendation system around a particular frame that is about to break. Third, while newsrooms and text creators have gotten smart about search engine optimization on Google and Bing, they're weak with YouTube, even though it is the primary search engine for the under 25 population. My colleague Becca Lewis is about to release a report that shows how media manipulators have leveraged data voids, recommendation processes on YouTube, and potential recruits' interest in self-investigation to walk people from quasi-mainstream debates to extremism in a matter of 2 to 3 links. Through the use of comments, linking, and strategic cross-participation, those who are curious to self-investigate follow breadcrumbs that were designed to promote conspiracy and hate. And unfortunately, most media-making organizations don't think about the networked nature of video or the importance of creating high-quality, easily findable content on YouTube. In addition to playing with those algorithmic systems, media manipulators exploit a psychological process known as apophenia. By creating connections between random ideas, manipulators warp the cultural imaginary. By inviting people to see artificial patterns, they engage potential recruits to see reality in their terms. And as part of the indoctrination process, they want those who are self-investigating to start to see media manipulators as being persecuted for revealing a reality that others seek to suppress. Martyrdom exists in most major religions. People have died violently and symbolically for their faith so that others could pursue the religious ideals that the martyr believed. In modern times, martyrdom has become far more complicated. On one hand, there's a rise of what can be understood as political martyrdom, as people have taken their lives to raise public awareness to particular causes. On the other, we've seen the proliferation of mass murder and terrorism to be committed under the false pretenses of religious martyrdom. Now, when we speak of martyrdom, we speak about death or the end of mortality. Given the grave nature of these acts, it's hard to draw on this concept metaphorically. But given the perversion of martyrdom in the last 20 years to maximize fear within society, I feel it's only appropriate to speak about the kinds of digital martyrdom that we're starting to see emerge. Most social media users who are given terms of service violation warnings quickly change their behavior. This is not the case for media manipulators. They know the rules, they intend to flaunt them, and they actively dare platforms to mess with them. They believe that being digitally crucified is to their cause's long-term advantage, especially if media outlets will help amplify their digital execution. So they push and they push. They hurt other people. They refuse to respond appropriately to restrictions. They bend the rules. They leverage irony to their advantage. They engage in rhetorical games so that it's very hard to pin them down because they know what they're doing. Their practices remind me a lot of what a hateful, homophobic Kansas minister used to do when he protested the funerals of LGBT people and picketed gay pride events. He knew the law, but he also knew how to get those who opposed him to actually fall over and violate the law. Just as lawmakers struggle to devise laws that would stop his hateful actions, tech companies continue to struggle to find policies that will prevent toxic abuse. Media manipulators know how to exploit the edges, and they know how to argue that tech companies aren't supporting free speech when they're getting banned. More importantly, they've learned that the key to the success is to become newsworthy in your minds. I've never met a journalist who entered the profession for nefarious reasons. I've also never met one of you who entered it to make money either. You're like educators in many ways. Most of you are passionate about giving people access to information. You espouse the ideals of journalism in a democracy. I relish your enthusiasm and your idealism. And let's be honest, that idealism is really important right now to be surviving the constant state of attacks that you're facing. Journalistic idealism is also very familiar to me coming from the tech sector. It's easy now to lambast major tech companies and accuse engineers of doing evil things for money. But the tech industry that I entered in the 1990s was full of idealism, full of a belief in changing the world for the better. The downside to embracing idealism is that it's really hard to be reflexive, to hear criticism, or to be challenged. This is why accusing journalists or engineers of conservative bias is so effective. Neither want to be seen as biased. So they twist themselves in knots to sort of deflect such a critique. And as a result, I recognize it's hard to not be defensive whenever I offer my own critiques, whether I'm talking to a journalist or to an engineer. I admit I was wary in preparing this speech of being too critical of a profession under fire. But I'm really hoping that you can hear what I'm saying, because frankly, our democracy depends on you recognizing that you're being manipulated. It depends on the tech industry recognizing how it's being manipulated. Understanding the vulnerabilities in news media and social media, but understanding what media manipulators are doing and why can help you strengthen your approach, just as it has to help strengthen the tech industry's approach. But we need to talk about capitalism. In this country, we are socialized into a narrative of capitalism that no longer exists. The capitalism of yore emphasized how efficient markets can enable innovation and growth while yielding all sorts of social benefits. Capitalism always required people to take financial risks, but over the last 40 years, we've seen a rise of a new set of financial instruments that are divorced from the services and products that are being produced. The finance sector has become increasingly extractive in its processes, enabling a new genre of capitalism that emphasizes short-term return on investment. This version of capitalism is corrosive, and without proper checks and balances, it has shaped every sector in society. To complicate matters, it's not just financiers now that depend on this system. We are all due. University endowments, pension funds, 401ks, they're all wedded to this version of capitalism. We all want the stock market to keep going up. But quick return on investment style capitalism has costs. It means that every public company is under pressure to make more money quarter by quarter. And consider what this means for a company like Facebook. Sure, you know Zuckerberg has a controlling share of the company. But his ability to keep his engineering talent from going somewhere else relies on him being able to increase the stock price, because the majority of their compensation is through stock. To do so, Facebook has three options. They either need to find more users, make more money per user, or diversify their portfolio of money-making services. Only so much of this can be done without tripping over the edge of exploitation. But it's not just Facebook that's beholden to this version of capitalism. The news industry has also been undermined by the financial sector. When you ask most folks about why journalism is struggling, they quickly point to the tech industry. There's no doubt that Craigslist and Google altered the advertising industry, or that the internet and mobile phones changed how people consumed information. But the financial precarity of the news industry began long before these changes. Hedge funds and private equity started taking over the newsrooms in the 1980s, and they control most of them today. They are not interested in the news business. They wanted your precious real estate. It wasn't in their interest to immediately shut you down, but they are not committed to your sustainability either. Many newsrooms have twisted themselves in knots to appease financiers, especially those that are sitting on their boards, cutting costs, ending pensions, reducing staff, etc. But it's never enough, is it? Publicly traded companies in the United States are not valued for having a double bottom line. So if you're not making more money per quarter, you will eventually collapse in this financial context. How does the news industry make more money quarter by quarter infinitely? Trying to appease the news industry doubled down on advertising, failing to recognize that the water was starting to boil. So when sweeping changes to the advertising industry happened, it was easy to blame tech for the downfall of capitalism. But it wasn't tech. It wasn't your financial model. It was the entire financial infrastructure, which has been financialized capitalism. And while there are ways in which newsroom can be sustainable, can be financially profitable, the ability to turn return on investment quarter by quarter is in many ways impossible. And so I don't think it's possible to do healthy journalism in an ROI context that the street knows how to exploit. And I don't know how to sort of push forward this conversation where we don't get trapped up in the questions of business models without really interrogating this new version of capitalism that is not the capitalism of your parents. Now, I don't know if the private equity and hedge fund firms that exploited the news organizations knew how much we would pay for the loss of local journalism. But I know that we're facing that pain right now. Most Americans do not trust journalism. But this is not because of your reporting. It's because you're an abstraction. It's because of the loss of local journalism. While he attended most of the sessions of the Constitutional Convention, George Washington did not participate in any of the debates that took place, except one. After an early draft of the Constitution suggested that the members of the House of Representatives should each represent 40,000 people, he stepped in to argue that the number should be reduced to 30,000. Why? He knew that the delicate American democracy depended on people knowing their representatives and felt that any number that was greater than 30,000 would create an elite governance class and create distrust in the public of the government. Today, each member of the House represents more than 700,000 people. Guess what? Most Americans do not trust our federal government. Trust is rooted in networks. If you don't know a journalist or know someone who knows a journalist, why should you trust the profession? 30 years ago, most people knew someone in their community that worked for a newspaper. That is not true today. So why did TV news develop such great gravitas in the middle of the 20th century? I mean, most Americans feel like they knew Edward Murrow or Walter Cronkite. TV anchors came straight into your living room. And psychologists referred to the process that this enabled as parasocial interaction. The audience feels as though they know these people as real people because they see them every day. They become personable. It's a great trick for working around actual social networks. But it's also the reason that news commentators are succeeding on TV in ways that paper journalism is not. It's also why all sorts of pundits, conspiracy theorists, and toxic commentators have created regular podcasts and YouTube channels. They know how to exploit parasocial interactions. You won't be able to earn the trust of the American public by doubling down on rigorous reporting, or focusing on the brand of your organizations, or trying desperately to appease those who accuse you of conservative bias. You will only earn the trust of the American public when you once again become part of the American fabric, when people in communities around the country know you, when they understand your practices because you are part of their communities, when you are part of their everyday lives. In short, you need to actively seek to understand the social graph of the American public and engage in what politicians right now are talking about as relational campaigns, the ability to be within 2 degrees of every American. My colleague Nancy Bain highlights how musicians have had to actually take this path and the ability to see this as a new way of actually doing outreach. But in order to be effective journalists in this new networked landscape, you need to be a part of the social fabric of America, not as observers, but as somebody who's actually part of the fabric that is engaged in knitting the fabric together through the connections. That's the innovation that is most critical and in many ways most unfamiliar to those in the news business. In the meantime, you do face another challenge. If manipulators are trying to use you to polarize American society, how do you not take the bait? If you do not allow, if you want to focus on getting trust, how do you make certain that you don't allow manipulators to make it harder for you to achieve trust? First, recognize the rubric by which you decide how to devote your time is not neutral. I don't mean this in a condescending sense or pejorative. I mean, own the fact that what makes something newsworthy is fundamentally subjective. It depends on the power of the actors involved. It depends on the norms of your audience. It depends on the implications for specific communities or countries. You have honed the muscles to focus on some stories and not others. You have also honed the ability to find a hook in order to make a particular news story worthy or interesting to your readers. But you're, of course, now navigating business interests alongside the recognition that an exhausted public most of the time prefers junk food, and a technology company ecosystem that actually is encouraged to give them junk food. Furthermore, because your organizations are rooted in an industry and a culture of competition, you're under pressure to be attentive to what others have deemed newsworthy, and that actually shapes a lot of what the coverage happens. And there be dragons everywhere. But like a good yogi or Jedi, your advantage is to constantly improve your awareness of the pressures and adversaries you face, to evolve your strategy for navigating what's going on. You need to recognize that in a networked era, every organizational and communicative process is exploitable. This is something that we in the tech industry refer to as security. But when journalism was the primary gatekeeper in society, it was hard for a story to break without journalists being involved. The people who were gaming you were fundamentally large-scale organizations, governments, or corporations. But now, just as algorithmic manipulators have learned to engage in search engine optimization and game Twitter's trending topics, media manipulators have figured out how to trick you into telling their story. Accept that this is the security of your business now, and figure out how to outsmart them. Case studies are often ways of seeing traps, so let me give you one. In 2010, an extremist anti-Islam pastor named Terry Jones began using social media to publicly threaten that he would burn the Quran in order to draw attention to his belief that Islam is of the devil. His goal was to attract mainstream news media, and his early press releases did very little of that. So most of the news ignored him. They thought he was a complete outsider. But bloggers and small-time news venues did not. They started picking up the story, and it started snowballing because he leveraged the coverage of lesser-known bloggers, along with algorithmic systems underpinning Yahoo News, to start to put pressure on larger and larger journalists to cover the story as newsworthy. And eventually it worked. As this process snowballed, as it gained steam, the media started to cover it, and then Secretary Clinton stated, "It's regrettable that a pastor in Gainesville, Florida, with a church of no more than 50 people can make this outrageous and distressful, disgraceful plan and get, the world's attention." Needless to say, that was covered. By this point, religious and political leaders were publicly asking him to cancel his plans, and this was being covered. He vowed not to burn a Quran publicly, but then, of course, the media coverage faded. So, in March of 2011, he oversaw the burning of a Quran, which was, of course, by that point covered in every news outlet because they were already paying attention to him. Violent protests broke out in Afghanistan, resulting in the deaths of 12 people, including at least 7 UN workers. Not all media are created equal. Yes, a blog post can go viral, but when a major news outlet chooses to cover a story that has received oxygen from bloggers, they amplify the message to wider audiences. Mainstream news decisions matter, even in a world of social media. What you choose to amplify has significant ramifications in what people discuss, share, and self-investigate. In her own brilliant report, The Oxygen of Amplification, my colleague Whitney Phillips used journalists' own words and experiences to detail how news media has been hijacked to amplify the messages of hate groups, using the exact same techniques that have been used for quite a long time in marketing firms and that we saw with that hateful pastor. My colleague Joan Donovan and I struggled to figure out how to give advice to journalists in light of this kind of media manipulation. So we did what academics did, and we pulled on history. We tried to find anchors looking backwards. She uncovered details about how newsrooms had learned to respond to their recognition that when they covered the KKK in the mid-20th century, they served the goal of hate rally organizers. I was more obsessed with the history of the Werther effect, which makes it very clear that how a news outlet covers a death by suicide can really affect the likelihood of copycats. Side note, I am very frustrated by the coverage of Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain. The scholarly literature describes this whole process and the techniques that journalists use in order to minimize harm as strategic silence. So we used this term as we started talking to people, and we faced a backlash. No matter how much we emphasize the importance of the strategic component of this practice, most people in the news business constantly reacted with outrage that we would ever suggest that silence would be a good thing. Case in point, when I broached this topic with a publisher of an esteemed newspaper, he told me that the Pentagon is regularly telling him not to publish things, and that it's his responsibility to make sure that the public hears what it needs to hear. I agree with him. But when the Pentagon is breathing down his neck, I can promise you his lawyers have been called and that he and his editorial team have dotted every I and crossed every T. They're careful because they've made a very hard call and they want to make certain that they do it right. They want the public to hear the message as it's intended. In other words, news organizations are already engaged in a practice, perhaps we should call strategic amplification. Everyone regularly chooses to cover stories that are too critical, too newsworthy to ignore. And folks think long and hard about how to tell that story because no one wants any slip-up to undermine the goal of conveying crucial information to the public. My wish is not to silence stories, but to make certain that those who are in the business of amplifying information recognize that it's as important to be sensitive to frames that benefit media manipulators as it is to be attentive to the ones that upset governments or corporations that might sue you. You're in the business of strategic amplification. There are all sorts of things that are effectively silenced in the process. Some are just not newsworthy, cats sitting on people's laps. But there's also newsworthy stories that many of you struggle to find a way to convince the public to care about. All of you covering Syria know that what's unfolding in Idlib right now is a disaster in the making. But finding the angle to make this more important than the hurricane is bloody hard. If you can recognize your agency and power in choosing what to amplify, then you have to start asking yourself, what's the value in amplifying messages that are designed to polarize, radicalize, or bolster those peddling hate? How you tell a story also matters. I would argue that you can effectively cover stories without serving the agenda of extremists if you understand what they're trying to do, if you understand their relationship to social and search. So let me give you a concrete example. When a 25-year-old struck terror on the streets of Toronto by driving a van over people, the incident was unquestionably newsworthy. Journalists scrambled for clues. Soon after, an angry Facebook post emerged suggesting a connection to an earlier shooting in California. What connected these two young men appeared to be a shared misogynistic attitude. They both seem to have participated in online forums of angry men who feel as though they need to find somebody to blame for their loneliness. They typically blame feminists, arguing that they have a right to a woman and that feminists have taken that right away from them. They advocate for enforced monogamy and reject the idea that rape is a bad thing. Their hateful views are supported in a toned-down version by more legitimate figures who often get a lot of media attention, including a university professor at the University of Toronto across the town from these acts of vehicular terrorism. These groups are also connected through a term that most of the public had not known prior to media coverage, a term that invited your readers to go searching and find a world of deep toxicity that only grew significantly after Toronto. I get it. The term incel is provocative, and it would excite your readers to learn more. But were those of you who propagated this term intending to open a portal into hell? Is amplifying that term newsworthy? You could have conveyed the exact same information without giving people a search term that was served as a recruiting vehicle for those propagating toxic masculinity. Choosing not to amplify hateful recruiting terms is not censorship. You wouldn't give your readers a phone number to join the KKK, so why give them a digital calling card? In my mind, this is about smart reporting. You don't need to send people to data voids or offer free advertising to hate groups to tell the story of terroristic act rooted in toxic masculinity. I get that you feel it's important to cover sides of a story, but since when is intolerance and hate a legitimate side? By focusing on bystanders and those who are victimized by hate, you can tell the story without reinforcing the violence. Extremists have learned how to use irony and slippery rhetoric to mask themselves as conservatives and argue that they are victims. Ignore their attention games. Focus your reporting on the wide range of non-hateful political views in this country that aren't screaming loud to trick you into getting their attention. There is no need to give oxygen to a fringe group who are acting like a bully in the third grade classroom. And it's unethical to justify that you're doing this just because others are using that term, or that people could use this to find information on social media and search engines. Your business is amplifying the terms that get people to search. Please don't throw in the towel. In 1927, Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis famously argued that the remedy to bad speech is more speech, not enforced silence. At the time, there was widespread agreement that speech can and must be curbed when it presented a clear and present danger. In Whitney versus California, Brandeis argued that it was unjust to prosecute a woman who was accused of helping the Communist Labor Party promote a violent overthrow of the government. He felt that political speech, even dangerous speech, was essential to democracy. Because of cases like this, we turn to Brandeis as one of the greatest advocates for free speech. But while Brandeis believed that anyone had the right to express their views, he did not believe that anybody had the right to be amplified. Most importantly, he didn't believe that anyone who had the means to shove a message down people's throat had the right to do so. In 1932, in a case called Packer Corporation versus Utah, Brandeis wrote the primary argument that said that Utah had the right to place restrictions on billboard advertisements by the tobacco industry. He argued that billboards must be treated differently than magazines because the former had captive audiences. In other words, people could choose whether or not to view a magazine, but to avoid a billboard, they'd have to intentionally divert their eyes. The media landscape has changed significantly over the last 86 years, but the nuance in Brandeis' arguments live on. Brandeis realized that the key to sustaining a commitment to free speech is to have a rich understanding of how people can abuse their power or manipulate the system to control what others hear. He recognized that even as the media landscape changed, so must be our approach to enabling First Amendment. This country was premised on the necessity of a free speech. Journalism is an essential part of democracy, not because of its financial power, but because of its ability to inform the public, to enable self-governance. The press's unique role in our country is rooted in a historically unique capacity to amplify information. Yet, just because the news media is no longer the only gatekeeper does not mean that the responsibilities of democratic governance can be ignored. Now more than ever, we need a press driven by ideals, determined to amplify what's most important by enabling an informed citizenry. This is not about clicks or what will appease hedge fund masters. We need voices that become information stalwarts, determined to explain complex issues to a public that moves between the news and technical mediators. I'm not suggesting you ignore where the public is. To the contrary, you want to start with their questions, and that's where the beauty of the relationship between the digital and your own business matters. Create explainer videos giving background on critical topics. Help people connect the dots between Syria and climate change by strategically linking videos across YouTube so that people can follow breadcrumbs, rather than thinking it's all about packaging it as one thing to be seen. Many of you have thoughtfully critiqued the tech industry for amplifying disinformation, while claiming that the platforms are neutral actors in the information landscape. We know they're not. There's indeed nothing neutral about an algorithmic system. Algorithmic systems fundamentally function by creating networks and enabling others to do so. And the moment that algorithmic systems affects what information people access, someone will work to manipulate that system in order to achieve their own goals. You are not algorithms, but you are also not neutral. And because you have the power to amplify messages, because you have power that you need to own, people also want to manipulate you. That is par for the course. And in today's day and age, it will not just be corporations, governments, and PR shops that have your number. Just as the US military needed to change tactics to grapple with a tribal, networked, and distributed adversary, so must you. Focus on those networks. Help people connect to information. Help connect information to each other. Help connect people to each other. Build the social fabric. Because at the end of the day, this democracy depends on you. Thank you. So now the fun part. I got to say a bunch of things that probably made many of you just sit there going, grr. Now is the point where you ask questions or push back. Are there microphones somewhere that I should point people to? Oh, man in yellow has microphone. Who wants to ask the first question? Oh, okay. He comes to you.
It was a fascinating speech, thank you for it. I was interested in something you said towards the end about choosing not to amplify, and I, under my breath, went, that's censorship, and then you said, it's not censorship. And I was wondering what you would do if we rewound to the past, and this was 1938. Should we not be covering the Nazis? And then going forward, should we not have told the public what ISIS is? And my colleague Rukmini Calamachi's work on exposing how it works, you maybe have listened to Caliphate. I think there's I hate to use this word slippery slope, but I don't understand where we pick and choose what to tell people and what not to, if our fear essentially is copycatting?
So I'm going to treat 1938 different than ISIS, because ISIS operates in a world of networked media, and 1938 doesn't, right? Which means that in 1938, the narrative gets controlled in a much more sane way, because you got to actually think through this. ISIS is different. Now, one of the things that's been interesting about much ISIS coverage is that there's two different kinds of ISIS coverage. There's coverage that's talking through the various activities that ISIS and ISIL have been engaged in over this period of time, very phenomenal reporting, trying to make a foreign issue a domestic relevant. Then there's coverage of beheading videos, right? Coverage of beheading videos was a manipulation tactic. You didn't need to show those beheading videos. You didn't even need to show a flat image of those beheading videos. You did not need to get people to go looking for those beheading videos by giving them terms that would do that. That's different than discussing about how you could easily report on the fact that in order to try to manipulate the American public, here is what they are doing, and this is this process by which they are purposefully actually undermining our speech. That reporting is completely reasonable. The other thing is that one of the nice things about the ISIS reporting, for better or worse, is that you aren't actually giving them terms to search for that get to the most egregious videos. So one of the things that those of us who live in the tech industry have been looking at with ISIS and ISIL-related content is how do people get to search terms that actually get them to extremism? So there's a very big difference. If someone searches for ISIS, 99.9% of the time, they're just trying to learn who this organization is and what's going on. Completely reasonable. The vast majority of content they get on search is news content. It's really detailed background. It's phenomenal reporting that you've done. When people search for phrases that are from particular speeches given by people in ISIS, they have been triggered to use that term, and that's where they get to a portal of extremism. Where are they getting that? Most of that is actually at the still point talk radio. What's different about, for example, white supremacism is that it's not just talk radio that's giving those search terms now. It's mainstream news. And that's a lot of what I'm talking about. It's about not restricting the ability to talk about what the Nazis do, what they believe in, why it's problematic, but don't personalize them, right? Talk about their political efforts, about their extraordinary racist behavior. They're not the person next door. Right? And this is about then talking about the people who were victimized by it, right? And this is where when we talk about it in a contemporary term, we talk about reporting on the people who actually are exposed to tremendous amounts of violence on the other side of racist violence. When we talk about it historically, a huge chunk of the reporting that was personalizing, once people started to understand and wake up to what was going on, was really about the victims. And that was a shift in the news. Now, I don't remember exactly what year Hitler was personified, but Hitler was given a Time magazine cover because at first it seemed actually a different story, and then it changed. So a lot of it is understanding what the narratives are. And that's one of the reasons, at the very simplest level, my ask of you is do not give search terms that will lead to problematic places, right? You can describe every aspect of it. You can have people searching for things like toxic masculinity, but you don't have to give a term that will get them to a specific underground space. And when you hear a term that seems to come up from these environments, think twice. Who's actually getting it? Do searches on it. What are they trying to get you to? Look on the second page. Above all, look on YouTube. Understand that these terms that are unique are the goal, but it doesn't mean you can't go through it. So I'll give you an example of a very helpful New York Times reporting on some of the white supremacy-related issues in this country. One of the pieces that they did that I think was really phenomenal was that they reported on one of the people who had been, in many ways, proselytized within these environments. And he had been proselytized under the idea that he had this huge military background. And the journalists had done a phenomenal job of going and figuring out that he had completely bullshitted his way through this. And so they actually told his story in a way that actually shamed him. Right? And fragmented in those environments because he was operating under false pretenses. So that is a way of reporting on somebody by making it very clear that they are doing something to achieve grandiosity that is not actually rooted in reality. But that's different than actually trying to make it something that is just normalized. Does that help? Where are folks with microphones? Down there.
Yes. Question of media funding, especially regrowing the local media infrastructure that is being hollowed out by news deserts. McChesney talks about citizen-directed subsidies for media like the U.S. Postal Service Act of 1792.
Yep. So this is why I put the section on capitalism in there, because I wish I knew a pathway forward to just focus on funding local journalism. But that pathway is wrapped up in a broader problem of what we've done to the financialization of every sector. And I say that because it's like, I don't know, like, if we were in a 1950s capitalism, I can come up with a lot of creative answers to your question. But in this version, that's one of the things that I still struggle over. I mean, there are phenomenal philanthropists that are doing really important work in local journalism, and I just give them massive kudos. But to do things at scale, we're going to have to sort of change the game. And that's part of the innovation that I think is really important. I think that the key for doing it is to figure out how we think of journalism not just as a competitive sport, but as a process of actually knitting people together. So the question then is, how do we not just think about hiring local journalists, but finding ways of actually using journalists as a curatorial process of information flows within communities? Which means that we'd be looking to other community organizations where you look to the practices and cultures of different kinds of reporting. Now, I'm not saying that this is the best solution, certainly not for investigative journalism. There's a lot that's sort of missing from that equation. But it's not going to be simple as like getting money into these environments. I think you know better than I that like even if we look back to 1972, the political landscape and government funding looked very different. So I think one of the things that I struggle with as I think about this process is that I actually think it's about how do we get more strategic at scale. So like one of the things that I've been sort of obsessed with, social media technologies, cell phone technologies, allow us to see the graph of the American public at scale. What that means in practice is that you can actually start to map out not information and news deserts by geography, but by subgraph of the social network. Because the subgraph of the social network is actually what can be most damaging. And so then the question is there other ways of engaging folks within subgraphs strategically? But the other place where I think that the key there is going to be shifting to a more collaborative news process, not a competitive news process. And I say that because when you have limited amounts of funding, having, a ton of different outlets all focused on the same story so that they can have it as their unique destination site is where you're going to have a huge resource challenge. But again, as long as these national news organizations are operating under this form of financialized capitalism, we can't do anything but make them competitive. But that's where it's like, that's the puzzle that I am struggling with, and if anybody has good ideas about how to undo that puzzle, I'm totally, interested in brain jamming. But I see, from my perspective, it's like, it's changing the versions of capitalism would be ideal and naive, and I'm not sure that's even remotely viable. Coming up with new ways of taking the news industry into a non-competitive approach so that it becomes more collaborative and taking it into more networked seem to me the key components of it, as opposed to just getting funding. I think just getting funding will be patchy at best. Back there.
Hi. So I'm currently getting my master's degree in journalism, and one of the research areas that I've been interested in is the idea of contagion effect or copycat effect in media as it pertains to suicide and mass shootings coverage. Yes. There is quite a bit on guidelines on how to be strategically silent about that. I'm wondering, as you assess this, is this a problem of awareness with media entities, or do you think that it's more of a pushback on the idea of this being a form of censorship?
So the Werther effect is a really interesting finding from the 1970s, where we realized that how the news would cover suicide would shape whether or not people would actually then go and be triggered to die by suicide. And it ended up, as all these studies would be reproduced, it wasn't just news media. I don't have anything nice to say about 13 Reasons Why. But what was interesting was that as the World Health Organization, as other organizations spilled out best practices in the late 70s and into the early 80s, Many newsrooms adopted this idea that they should be thoughtful about how to cover it. And they were. And if you looked at the reporting for the better part of a decade, people got more and more sophisticated. You don't put suicide in the headlines. You don't describe the details of how people died. You make certain that you give hotline information. There's a whole variety of best practices. Check out the World Health Organization. It also all came undone about 10 years ago, and I've been trying to sniff around and figure out why. And one of the things that I would ask journalists who were reporting on this if they had heard about those guidelines, many of them had, but their editor had told them they should cover it because somebody else was covering it. And it was always about pointing to someone else, particularly around celebrity suicides. So Columbia University decided to do analysis of the Robin Williams case. And if I remember the numbers correct, they were on the order of magnitude right. It was a 16% increase in suicide and a 32% increase in the copycat of mode. That means that describing how people die actually really matters because it gives people an idea who are already on the edge of suicide potential as this. Now, I'm on the board of an amazing organization called Crisis Text Line, where unfortunately we can track the impact of reporting because we get flooded with people who always reference it. They reference the stories. They reference, well, if Anthony Bourdain did this, then why can't I? Clearly, I'm never going to be as successful as him. Right? And so you can see all of this feeding into the American psychology. This does not mean that you shouldn't cover the fact that Anthony Bourdain died. Of course you should. But you do not need the word suicide in your notifications sent out to everybody's phone. You do not need suicide in the headline or in the first section. You need to make certain that people have access to different kinds of resources, that they know where to turn in different ways. You need to think of it as a part of an ecosystem. Now, that doesn't mean people won't start searching. They always search after this, right? I mean, I can talk you through all of the searches for Anthony Bourdain. And one of the things that's really tricky for those who have us to do anything related to search is to then try to find other ways of adding that content, right? And this is what we've been trying to work with the tech industry. And I have a lot of frustration with the tech industry on the way that they handle this as well. But my ask on this is there are best practices for industry. And I understand that it's being covered on blogs in detail. And I understand that the public wants to know gory details about how somebody died. That doesn't mean that amplifying it is actually for the general benefit of the public. But it is newsworthy, of course, to cover that someone died, to celebrate their life, and to make certain that anybody who is curious to learn more has access to the support structures that they need.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, so I'll let you guys duke it out, but we'll do one more.
I think the microphone folks got it. Go for it.
Hey, thanks for the presentation. It was great. What are some take out of this room immediate practical tips that reporters, that editors in small newsrooms and medium newsrooms and large newsrooms that journalism professors can take out of here to make structural changes in the way their organizations are laid out, in the way they do their jobs to kind of put some of this into practice? Because I don't have to tell you that you know that people are doing a lot more with a lot less. And so it's easy to say, hey, these are some good ideas. It's easy to have a training session in a conference room for 30 minutes at noon. But unless you have someone backstopping, unless you have standards in place, I find it hard to see how actual meaningful change will happen. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there are a lot of low-hanging fruit, smaller things, right? Like when we just talked about the World Health Organization lists. Make a commitment as every organization that you're going to abide by them. Collectively build the lists on how you're going to deal with certain kinds of search term-oriented media manipulation. Make a commitment as an industry of how you're actually going to start taking this as an ethical stance. Train people with, all of you who are working in the journalism schools, train people to understand that they have to not just think about the physical security of their bodies, but the security of all of the different people that are manipulating them. There's already processes in place to talk about doubting government groups or to doubt corporations, right? That's already in place. You need to add networked actors to that training process. All of these are about a form of what we would talk about as situational awareness, right? The ability to really understand the complexity. And I do believe that all of this is actionable. The local news challenge is a lot less immediately actionable, right? And I think there are baby steps that can be taken, and I want to celebrate those in the room who are working on a lot of those baby steps. But at the same time, I think that's a longer term. But the short term is really about search term, actor manipulation and being aware of those. And I will also say, I'm going to sort of shout out to my colleague Sam here, who's also happy to get you a lot of the different information and how people are doing it. Because one of the things we're also trying to make certain of is that you collectively have sources that you can call on background being like, is this part of an agenda? And I think that's also one of the things that's really important is how do you have sources, just like you do when you deal with corporations and with governments, who are okay, here's how this agenda is being played out. And that's for specific subgroups and dealing with subbeats. It's a lot harder when we're dealing with other topics, right? But I do think that there's a lot of it which is about making commitments, and it's about reinvigorating what is the question of ethical journalism in this networked age where the relationship is not just about your news story going on social media, but the relationship between social media, news, search as a constant interplay. And with that, I want you to have a phenomenal conference, and I look forward to talking to all of you later. Thank you.
Danah, thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. Everybody, please enjoy ONA18. The exhibit halls in Midway open at noon, and we'll see you tonight at ACL Live. Thanks.